Namaskara, good evening, and welcome to today's BIC Streams session, Dholavira, a Harappan city, now a World Heritage Site. Dholavira in Gujarat has recently been added to UNESCO's list of World Heritage Sites. This illustrated talk by writer Meera Iyer and conversation with researcher and writer Anirudh Kanisetti will highlight some of what makes Dholavira an outstanding example of a Harappan city. The 5,500-year-old settlement is famous for its town planning and its careful attention to water harvesting and storage, which made it possible for this bustling city to thrive for centuries in the arid environment of the Kutch. This session will talk about what we know about how people in Dholavira lived and ate, who they traded with, and what they might have made, bought, and sold. One of the fascinating things about the Harappan civilization is its as yet undeciphered script. In Dholavira, archaeologists discovered a very intriguing and unique signboard. What might this have said? Sometime after 1800 BCE, Dholavira and indeed the whole Harappan civilization began to fade away. Scholars believe this decline was brought about by climate change and attendant economic and social changes. Meera and Anirudh will also discuss the process by which a site is inscribed on the list of World Heritage Sites and what this coveted UNESCO tag might mean to Dholavira. The speaker bios will appear on your chat box, which is at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And through the session, if you have any questions, comments, or observations to share, please feel free to use the Q&A box, which is also at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And with that, I hand it over to Anirudh for some opening comments.
Thank you so much, Lekha. And thank you so much to the BIC for hosting this event just a couple of days after Dholavira has been announced as a World Heritage Site. It's a fascinating site, as we're going to discuss over the course of the next hour and a half or so. But let me briefly begin by talking a little bit about the broader sweep of Harappan history. The Harappan civilization, or the Indus Valley civilization, is by far one of the most fascinating and enigmatic of all Bronze Age civilizations. At its peak, it had a population of nearly 4 million people or so, which is more than that of Mesopotamia and Egypt combined. And it had dozens, if not hundreds, of urban centers. So by far, it was really the juggernaut of the Bronze Age. It had trade networks stretching all the way into Tajikistan and into the Levant and even the Mediterranean. We have evidence of Levantine merchants, for example, who actually lived in the Indus civilization at various points. And the Harappans are also fascinating because of their extraordinary engineering abilities, which is something that we'll definitely get into today. We have examples of Lothal, a port in Gujarat, not too far away from Dholavira, where the Harappans actually built essentially dry docks for their shipping. So it's a really, really interesting civilization with connections all over the Bronze Age world. And Dholavira is really a wonderful example of its trade connections and tells us so much about the lives of the people who really made this civilization. So without any further ado, over to you, Meera. Looking forward to your fascinating presentation.
Thank you, Anirudh. I'm going to share my screen. Just give me a minute. Hang on. Can you see it, Anirudh?
Yes, we can see.
Okay, so thanks, Anirudh. And yes, today we're going to be speaking about Dholavira, which a Harappan city. And the reason why we're here is, of course, this news that came just 2 days ago. It was inscribed by UNESCO as a World Heritage City, the 40th Heritage City in India, Heritage Site in India. And this is, of course, like a really exciting and proud moment for India. Today, I will speak a little bit about what is a heritage site, what makes a heritage site, and then we'll speak a little bit about Dholavira itself and its place in the larger Harappan civilization. Okay. So, what is a World Heritage Site actually? So, there's a term that's used here, outstanding universal value, which really, it's kind of self-explanatory, but what makes a World Heritage Site a World Heritage Site is if it has some significance that is of such immense value to all of humanity that it deserves to be declared a World Heritage Site. So if it has outstanding universal value, that's like the crux of the issue. This is like the main pillar on which the status stands. In addition, we have a couple of other traits.
Meera, sorry, can I just intervene? There's a clicking noise that's coming from your end, which...
maybe it's better now.
Yes, yes. Sorry,
Okay, thanks. Authenticity and integrity. Authenticity meaning like, have there been modifications to the site? Integrity meaning like, is the site well preserved, in a nutshell. Now, there are 10 criteria by which you can nominate a World Heritage Site, and I'll speak a little bit more about this later. But essentially, there are different types of World Heritage Sites. It can be cultural, like Dholavira. It can be natural, like the Western Ghats, for example, or it can be mixed. And there are also single sites, there are groups of sites, and there are also transnational sites, like the Silk Road, for example, which is spread across several countries. There's a very common misconception that once a site has been declared a UNESCO World Heritage Site, it's protected by UNESCO. It is not. UNESCO neither protects it nor funds WHS. It's actually really, it just recognizes it as being a World Heritage Site. So the journey to becoming a World Heritage Site, it is actually a really long journey. So the first step is that you need to be added to what's called the tentative list. Now, there's no guarantee that if you're on the tentative list, you're going to make it to the World Heritage Site, because there are sites on Indian sites on the tentative list which have been sitting there for more than 10 years. So if and when the government, the state government, the city, the central government, if they decide to push it to the next level, then you prepare what's called a nomination dossier, which is essentially you research and compile and put together all information on the site, especially the outstanding universal value, the criteria, and so on. And you talk about how you're going to manage the site. Essentially, it's like a deep dive into the history, geology, everything of that site. Now, Dholavira's was submitted last year, Jan, and this will be followed by reviews, desk reviews. There'll be a site visit by UNESCO team. And then, of course, 2 days ago, this is what happened. 27th is when it was declared as a World Heritage Site. That's not the end of the journey, because after that, UNESCO does send a mission every 2 years just to see that everything is going okay. So, for example, some of you may remember that Hampi was for a while an endangered site, and then Liverpool has just been knocked off the list this year. So it does happen. So I spoke about the 10 criteria under which it can be nominated. Now there are 6 which are cultural criteria, which cover things like architecture, technology, and so on and so forth. And there are 4 which are natural. Now, in the case of Dholavira, it was nominated under 2 criteria, under the cultural criteria. The first, criterion 3, says that Dholavira bears a unique and exceptional testimony to a cultural tradition of a civilization which has disappeared. So the key points here are that it's an exceptional example of a Harappan site, right? So by that I mean that the site actually, the Harappan civilization, you have the early phase, mature phase, late phase, and in Dholavira, you see all phases of this civilization, because the site has been occupied for more than 1,500 years. A second criterion under which it has been nominated is states that it's an outstanding example of a type of building, architectural or technological ensemble, which illustrates a significant stage in human history. Again, really, really apt, because what it's talking about here is that Dholavira is a wonderful example of Harappan city planning. So it's got multi-layered fortifications, fantastic attention to water harvesting and drainage, and of course the use of its building material. So, many of these are facets of Harappan planning, but the thing is that in Dholavira, you see it's distinct from other cities of the Harappan civilization, which means it's actually contributing unique and valuable knowledge to the Harappan civilization as a whole. So I will come back, keep in mind these points that we've spoken about: planning, fortification, water harvesting, the fact that it shows all phases of the civilization, because these are the criteria under which it's been nominated, and we'll come back to this through the presentation. So you'll see for yourself now. The discovery of the civilization, of the Harappan civilization, it's about 100 years ago. In the 1920s is when excavations started there. And 97 years ago, so in September 1924, is when John Marshall announced this this discovery in the Illustrated London News. And it was a very, very exciting moment, because until then, the history of India was known up to Ashoka. And then after that was like this big blank. And now with the discovery of the civilization, the history of the subcontinent is pushed back like to 5,000 years. So it was like a really major moment in Indian history. So there were excavations in Harappan. That was the first site that was found, that was discovered. There were also, soon after, there were excavations that began in MohenjoDaro as well. And then in 1947, independence, and then partition, and Harappa and Mohenjo-daro both went to Pakistan. So there was, so in the 1950s, there was a search for remnants of the civilization that could be found this side of the border. And so you had a lot of archaeologists who were combing the areas around Gujarat and Rajasthan. And so in the 1950s, Lothal, which is another very famous Harappan site in Gujarat, that was found in the 1950s. J.P. Joshi found Dholavira in the 60s. And excavations in Dholavira started in 1989, and they were led by Dr. Bisht, who's from the Archaeological Survey of India. And I must add here that several archaeologists have actually, it's like a training ground for many archaeologists in India, Dholavira in particular. Okay, so the Harappan civilization, as Anirudh also just spoke about very briefly, it's like, let's revisit the time period that we're talking about. So when we say Harappan, we're really looking at a time that starts around 7,500 years ago. Now, before this, there was a period when, say 9,000 BC is when in the Indian subcontinent, you start seeing the beginnings of agriculture. But around 7,500 years ago, so 5,500 BC, is when you see settlements, several settlements in the region that becomes later the Harappan region. Several settlements, which by 2,600 BC you start seeing it really becomes a very predominantly urban civilization. So when we say this is the period, the mature Harappan, also the period during the integration era, 2600 BCE to 1900 BCE. This 700-year period is what we think of. When you say Harappan, things come to your mind. You immediately think of seals and writing and planning, and all of these are very, very characteristic features, which really are characteristic of this period, the 700-year period. From about 1900 BCE, there's a change. There's the cities are no longer integrated, no longer connected with each other that much. So there's a localization, and then there's a de-urbanization that happens, and then there's a transformation. So you've probably seen maps like this in school. I know I did, but I forgot. But so here's the extent of the Harappan civilization, and you'll see that it's like a really vast area. In fact, it's like bigger than most of the other contemporary ancient civilizations, including the Mesopotamian and the Egyptian and the Chinese and all. And we have more than 1,400 sites that have been found in this civilization. Around 900 or so in India and counting, and the remaining in Pakistan. And there are a few large cities, which I'll speak about shortly, but there's really hundreds of villages and small towns and villages and hamlets that really are all over this area. So we have, these are some of the larger cities. So there's Harappa, the first one discovered. A little south of that, somewhere around here, is Ganeriwala, which has not been excavated yet. That's about 80 or so hectares. Mohenjo-daro, which is again a very large site. And close to MohenjoDaro, there's another city called MohenjoDaro, which has also not been excavated, but it's thought to be around 358 hectares, so also a very large city. And Rakhigari, of course, a very exciting place in Haryana, very large, but not fully excavated. And then you have Dholavira, which is one of the best known examples of the Harappan civilization in India and has been excavated, of course. So Dholavira actually lies on an island in the middle of the great run of Kutch. And immediately this makes it different from the other cities that we've spoken of so far. Because, if you had come to Dholavira, today when you go to this area, then, a few months of the year, there's like a salty marsh, and a few months of the year, it's completely dry. But if you had come to Dholavira during the Harappan period, you would have actually sailed to Dholavira because this run was navigable. So we really should be thinking of Dholavira as maybe connected to the other cities of the Harappan civilization through a maritime network. So I did, one of the reasons why Dholavira was nominated was because it shows this entire, all the phases of the Harappan civilization, right? So let's see how the city actually changed over time. So around 3000 BCE, in fact, even a little bit earlier than that, like recent studies have pushed this early date back to 3500 BC, but we'll keep it at 3000 BC. It started as a small walled settlement, which very quickly, there were these residential areas that came to the north of the settlement. A little bit later, you have an additional walled settlement that is built. So you can see the city growing very organically. And I must add here that when these terms that I use, castle and bailey, these are all terms that were given to these areas by the people who excavated the site. So Dr. Bisht basically named these as castle and bailey. A little ahead by around a third stage within this evolution of Dholavira, what was earlier residential areas is now cleared, and you have a ceremonial ground, which I'll speak about a little later. And there's a huge residential area that comes up, which was dubbed by the excavators as a middle town. And very importantly, you see here reservoirs that are being built. Now, we have been speaking about how one of the characteristics of Dholavira was this very careful attention to water harvesting. So you will see to the north of the settlement, there is a rivulet, like a stream called the Mansar, and to the south, there's the Manhar. And these are very, very ephemeral streams. So what the Harappans did was they actually built a few dams, and they channeled the water that was then collected behind these dams into the eastern reservoir. Okay, so we're talking about 4,500 years ago that this happened. And of course, during within the settlement itself, there was a lot of attention paid to water harvesting. So there are channels that go all across the castle and bailey, and all that collects and comes into reservoirs here. And it's believed that there are reservoirs here as well as here to the south, as well as to the west. And in fact, 2 years ago, when we last went, there was a trial excavation to the east of the eastern reservoir, where again, it was believed that there may be some more structures there. Okay, so a little further, let's go back to the timeline, a little further down, by around 2600 BCE, there's an additional residential area that's made called, we call it the lower town. And this is the final form that Dholavira takes. And you'll see that it's, a fortified settlement. There are multiple levels of fortification. There's the castle, the bailey, the middle town, which has its own fortification, and the entire city is also within the fortification wall. So very different from the layout in other Indus cities. Okay, so this is the final form of Dholavira, the maximum that it expanded to. And then there was a decline. So the reservoirs no longer function. There was, they were damaged possibly by floods or earthquakes, and they were never repaired. So they were never functional after a point. By around the 1900 BCE, they were never quite functional. And then you start seeing, the architecture is not really maintained all that well. And then the town shrinks even further. It's abandoned for a while, and then it's reoccupied. And this is the final stage of the occupation in around 1500 or so BCE, and eventually it is abandoned. this is an artistic representation of what the city might have looked like. My cursor is pointing to the castle, and to its west is the Bailey. This is the middle town and the lower town. And you'll see that, there were reservoirs, like quite a few, which together they stored millions of liters of water, actually. Today, when we go to Dholavira, you need to cross the Great Run of Kutch to get to the island of Khadirbet. And on either side of you, if you go during the months, say from January, February, March and all, you will see this, what looks like water here is actually the Great White Desert, because this is a desert of salt. And when I say salt, I mean like crunchy salt. It's like completely dry. It's an otherworldly experience to be walking on this desert of salt, which is completely white, right? And this is what has given its name to the modern village of Dholavira. So Dhola here means white. And I must stress that this is a modern name for this particular village. We don't know what the Harappan city was called, of course, but we will use the name Dholavira for the ancient metropolis as well. So this is the modern village of Dholavira, and about a kilometer away is the ancient city of Dholavira. And immediately you're struck by the fortifications, multiple levels of fortifications, and they're actually pretty impressive because, at the earliest phase of the civilization, when it first, of Dholavira, when it first started, these walls were 11 meters thick. And over time, they've been added to and added to and added to. So they're really, really wide, really, really, in its heydays, it should have been much taller. It would have been an impressive site. It still is an impressive site. So let's enter into the citadel. We're now at the eastern gate, and already you can see like differences in the construction. For example, the wall to the left on my screen here is different from the wall right at the forefront, because this is at a later phase, and you can see these differences in construction styles throughout the site. This is another view of the eastern gate as we are entering. Now, the thing about Dholavira is it's like stepping into a time warp, and because it's such an ancient site, there's so many things about it which are the first this, the first that, and So, for example, okay, let's look at, this is the gate. On the left here, we have an area which is probably a guard room. Now, usually fortifications will have guard rooms at their entrances. So this is probably a guard room. Or it might have been a place where you pay your taxes before you enter the city, or it could have been both. And these structures that you see in front are actually pillar bases. So there's this structure here, this concave pillar base made of limestone. And there's another structure here. So you can totally imagine, there have been these two pillars standing here and a roof over there. So what you're seeing here, these pillar bases, and then there are these more fragments of pillars here, these are actually the earliest architectural elements of this kind that you will see anywhere in the country. Let's take a closer look at it. This is made of limestone, and look at the finish. Like, the Harappans were such perfectionists, ekdam so smoothly finished. So there's something, of course, this is a work of art in itself, but there's something extra special about this. If you go to other Harappan cities such as Harappa and MohenjoDaro, you see similar things, like made with the same kind of limestone. So these are called ring stones, and they probably functioned as parts of pillars. What's really interesting about these stones is that this particular banded limestone, these particular stones, actually came from a quarry site, which is about 4 kilometers away from the city of Dholavira. And you can see this is the quarry site. So you can see where they were making pillars. You can see the chiseled material left behind from chiseling pillars around here. And they were transported from here over 1,000 kilometers away to Harappa. That's amazing. So let's get back to Dholavira. We're inside the citadel now. And again, you can see multiple levels of fortification all over. And remember, once again, we spoke about how you can see all phases of the Harappan civilization here, right? So this structure that you see here dates from the late Harappan period. So the post-Harappan also you can call it. And if you look at the structure, the circular kind of shape that it has, it resembles in many ways the structures which are made in Kutch even today. You'll have these circular residential units called bhungas. So it seems to be linked to that in some way. So this is really a late Harappan period, but I must add that when I say late or post-Harappan, it is still more than 3,000 years old. But of course, Dholavira, again, to get back to the point of water management, this is a recurring theme in Dholavira, water management. So you do see, of course, wells. There is one big well in Dholavira, and interestingly, like Khadirbet is actually, the wells in Khadirbet are known supposedly for their sweet water. This doesn't have water anymore. It's large and one of the deepest wells actually in the Harappan civilization. And if you notice, you can see the stone in the forefront, in the front of my screen, and you'll see these little grooves, which comes from, hundreds of years of people drawing water using ropes, and that's left a little mark on it. And these are these little things that you notice, which really, connect you to that place right away. Now, imagine you're standing here on the sloping stone and you're pulling water up and you pour it from that container into your little container. There's going to be some water that sloshes around. There's a drain, there's a little drain that actually takes all that water that would have spilt and channels it into a tank away. So every drop of water is precious here. So here are some of the other water storage structures that you'll see within the castle. And a lot of course, the exciting stuff really is happening underground, because you remember I mentioned that there's a channel that goes through the castle. It goes through the castle underground, and you can actually walk in it. So this is the stormwater drain that goes through the entire castle. It's a portion of it is open, so you can actually walk through it. And it has manholes, because you would be able to go in and you could actually clean that area as well. So I really wish, throughout, whenever I go to Dholavira, I keep thinking, I wish BBMP people would go there and learn about water management. So all these channels, of course, they collect the water, the rainwater that's harvested, and they take it to the reservoirs, some of which I showed you earlier. So this is on the southern side, and this is a cascading set. So there's water that collects here, and the overflow goes from here into the next tank, and then into the next tank. This particular one is a rock cut reservoir. This is the eastern reservoir, which is one of the earliest that was built on the site. And take a look at the work, the walls. Okay, so now when we say Harappan civilization, at least when I was in school, first thing again that comes to mind is mud bricks. Now in Dholavira, the earliest phases were indeed made with mud brick, but for a very long time, for most of the site, actually the building material was stone. So what you're seeing here is sandstone, beautifully cut and so perfectly laid. So there are steps that go down to the level of the water. As the water would dry out, you would actually be able to still go down the steps and reach the level of the water. So it's like step wells anywhere in Gujarat and Rajasthan that you find today. And when the water really dried out, well, there's a little well that's actually built here. So you can actually go right there and collect the water. So incredible thought paid to how to store and manage water. Okay, so back in the Citadel, we just did a quick tour of the castle. Let's go to the Bailey, which is an adjoining, again, a fortified settlement. And it had residential areas. It also had workshops. What kind of workshops? Craft workshops, where they were making, among other things, beads. So a few years ago when we took some children there, it was such an exciting moment, because you could actually find debitage, that is the waste material left behind from processing, from bead making, right? Now, obviously, the Harappan civilization, you all already know that it was very famous for its jewelry. So these are from a royal cemetery in Ur. And sorry, just a minute. Yeah, these are from a royal cemetery in Ur. And what you're looking at is these reddish stones here are all carnelian beads, and these kind of long carnelian beads, which could be 2 inches, 2.5, sometimes even 3 inches, the technology to drill these long carnelian beads in this particular shape, this biconic shape, is something that was a specialization of the Harappans. So generally, when you see these kind of beads, most likely you can say these are from the Harappan civilization. So this was one of the big export items, right? So carnelian beads, and then in addition you have, I mean, this again is carnelian, and in fact, this is what our company is named after. There's also like bloodstone, and Dholavira was, of course, known for its bloodstone as well. In addition, there's lapis lazuli, there's Jasper, all kinds of beads that were made in the Harappan civilization and transported over to um, various parts of the world, especially, of course, Mesopotamia and also other regions in Iran and so on and so forth. So international trade was like a very, very important part, a very important feature of the Harappans. Okay, and there are several inscriptions that talk about international trade that have been found, that speak about the Harappans that have been found in Mesopotamia. This is one of the more famous ones, which talks about the ships from Meluha, from Magan, and from Dilmun that go to the port in the Akkadian kingdom. Dilmun here is Bahrain. Magan is often thought to be Oman, but it's probably Makran, the coast of Makran. And then you have Meluha, which is the Harappan region. What's really incredible is that if you go to Khambhat, now Khambhat in Gujarat is one of the world's largest bead making centers. And you find people who are making and working beads using technologies which are actually very similar to what must have been happening 5,000 years ago. So on the left, you have Anwar, who's using a hammer made of buffalo horn to chisel beads. And Pratap Bhai there is using a bow drill to drill beads. And in fact, like these beads which I'm wearing were actually made by Anwar Carnelian. Let's get back to Dholavira, where now this is a view of the citadel again from the northern side. And again, the fortifications are quite impressive. There's like a bastion at the corner. There are bastions on most of the corners. And look at the gate here. This is the northern gate into the citadel. And again, you can see it's flanked by guard rooms. And this is the site where there was this very exciting discovery, one of the most famous things found in Dholavira, which is what's called the Dholavira signboard. So when I say signboard, what I mean is there were these bits of gypsum that were inlaid in wood. And this is a very large thing I'm talking about, around 3.5 feet long, 3.5 meters long. And, over time, the wood decayed, but the gypsum was still left. So it's a very exciting discovery. So most likely, this particular signboard, it was probably, placed over the northern gateway. Now, what does it say? Did it say welcome? Did it say beware? Did it give the name of the village, of the place? We don't really know, because of course we don't know we haven't deciphered the script as yet. So there are thousands of inscriptions that have been found, but it's very difficult to actually decipher it, simply because most of these inscriptions are so short. Of course, there are lots of people working on using computing power to see if this can be deciphered. So either that works, or we find the bilingual somewhere, and then hopefully soon we'll be able to decipher this. Now, I'd like to just draw your attention to these seals. You've all probably heard of Indus Valley seals. These are going to be just about very small, just like 2.5 centimeters or so. But each one is a work of art, because with the minimal lines, they're actually very realistic representation of, say, the bull or the unicorn. Back to Dholavira, and here we have a ceremonial ground, as Dr. Bisht called it, which may have also served as a like a multi-purpose ground. There could have been a place for a bazaar. It's likely that it was also some sort of arena for sports, because in fact there are seating areas that were found here. So you can totally imagine that people were sitting there and watching something going on there, whether it was a procession or wrestling, or it may have doubled up as a marketplace as well. So the idea that they were incorporating these open spaces within the city, that's remarkable, what we don't have now. So let's step into, through another fortification wall, into the middle town. This is what it looked like during the excavation. This is what it looks like now. And for me, like this is like one of the most exciting things about Dholavira is, especially like, for example, when you think of other ancient civilizations, when you think of Egypt, you see pyramids. So when you think of the Mesopotamians, you see palaces and ziggurats and all that, monumental architecture of that kind. In Dholavira, what you see is everyday heritage. Like you can actually walk into people's houses. You can see how they lived. You can actually imagine this must have been a courtyard. This must have been the living area. This must have been the kitchen. This must have been the bathroom. And we know that that was probably the wash area because you can see the difference in the flooring here and you can see the drains. So it's very exciting to see drains in Dholavira. Really, really exciting. And again, it may be because I come from Bangalore, but like perfect slopes, and the wash water would have come out of these little drains here. And there's a platform here, and you can see little bits of pottery that would have that are remnants of what would have been a pot that a sump pot would have which would have collected the waste, so that waste was not running through the middle of the street. It would have been collected and then discarded somewhere. In some places, you could even actually until a few years ago, you could even see the remains of these pots in situ, which is quite exciting. Beautifully made drains that you see of stone, perfect slope. And I look at these a drain like this terracotta drain, and I think 5,000 years ago somebody made it, and I can still see it. And I find that incredibly exciting. But of course, there was a decline. So around 1900 or 1800 BCE, there was a major change, likely caused by climate change, because recently, about 3 years ago, there was this. The period that we're in, geologically speaking, is the Holocene, and there was a new age that was named the Meghalayan Age, which marks this period around 4,200 years ago, the beginning of a period of aridity, of dryness, which affected not just the Indus, but also the Akkadian Empire, for example, and then the Egyptian kingdom at that time. So it was a worldwide event, and it was marked by a period of a weakening in India of a weakening of the monsoon. And so this had its cascading impacts. There was a decline in trade. There was less interaction between cities. The cities were depopulated, and there was a transformation, definitely. And the civilization as we knew it no longer existed. It transformed into something else. Okay. Raghu, can I have the video? So I come to the end of my presentation about Dholavira, but I'd like to end with a video from a friend of ours in Dholavira called Jaimal, and he will just give his view on what World Heritage Site means to him. Raghu?
अच्छा है, ये जगह धोलावीरा एक बहुत प्राचीन सभ्यता है, तो उनके लिए कई सालों से ये काम तो चल रहा है. मतलब देखा जाए तो स्थानीय लोगों को क्या फ़ायदा होना चाहिए और क्या उनके लिए क्या देखना चाहिए. तो ऐसा है कि धोलावीरा का लोगों को फ़ायदा तो होगा, टूरिज्म से डिपार्टमेंट से होगा, और मतलब फ़ायदा होने से पहले ये साइट को मतलब हम कैसे प्लानिंग से बचाएं और टूरिज्म को कैसे प्लान से ले आए, और हमारा धोलावीरा में रोज़गार बढ़े, और टूरिज्म डिपार्टमेंट से मतलब हमारा धोलावीरा का लोगों को शिक्षण भी बढ़ेगा. तो ये हमारा कहना है कि ये जो साइट है उनके लिए टूरिज्म बढ़ाना है तो पहले उनका प्लानिंग होना चाहिए.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, what a fascinating presentation, Meera. Thank you so much. Like you literally took us from the tiniest little details of these lives of people who must have been so similar to us, the same kind of emotional worlds that we inhabit, they lived in, and all the way up to these like incredible forces of climate and so on, before which the entirety of the Bronze Age world basically kind of withered and collapsed. So thank you so much. And I have a whole bunch of questions. The first, of course, is related to what our friend was saying just a little earlier about planning about tourism. The World Heritage Site status and just the sheer amount of like buzz is generated on social media, I imagine that is going to lead to a massive spike in tourism. How is all this going to really impact Dholavira itself as an archaeological site?
Yeah, that's a really good question, Anirudh. And much as we're really excited and happy about the site getting this WHS tag, it also does come with a little bit of worry because the site is a fragile site. So as Jaimal kept saying, it needs planning. It needs planning. So the tourism needs to be regulated. It needs to be regulated in some way, because otherwise, not just there's the fact that there'll be increased tourist footfall for sure. There's going to be more commercialization. Do we really want like resorts all around Dholavira? What are the ways in which this can be managed? How do we regulate the number of people who actually go onto the site? Because we've been visiting for several years, like every year there now, and I feel like there are things that I saw a few years ago which I can no longer see at the site. Pipes and terracotta pots which no longer are visible on site. So now, are we going to lose more of it like that? It's possible unless it's actually planned. And particularly, this is true of any site, but particularly for Dholavira, I think it's more of a problem because it's on an island. And so like everything has to come from the mainland. So when tourists go there, they're supplied with mineral water, bottles of mineral water. And where are these bottles dumped? Outside the resort. So how are we going to manage all of this? I think really exciting as it is, and it deserves more attention. The site definitely deserves more attention. We also need to look at putting in place mechanisms so that we can actually manage this increase in tourism.
That's fascinating, and it's kind of tragic that those pottery shards are no longer visible, because those really like brought up so many questions when you shared that photo of that little pot next to the drainage pipe. I was just thinking, what kind of calamity happened that a family would just leave this behind? Like all these little fragments of their lives, and what kind of stories did these people really have coming here, making a life in this relatively hostile frontier region where they have to like literally struggle for every drop of water they drank. It's really incredible to think about. But actually, while we're on that subject, like while we're talking about daily lives of people who lived in this settlement, do you know anything about the kind of food that they ate? Is that something that actually like remains in the archaeological record?
Yeah, incredibly, yes. So there are various ways you can find this out. So of course, like one very easy thing is if you will find bones, for example, of chickens. And in fact, like the Harappan civilization is one of the places where the chicken was first domesticated, 2500 BC or so. So you do find chicken and pig and goats and sheep and all of that. So we know that, yes, and fish and all of these were eaten, of course. But you also find now archaeologists have actually looked at residues that you find in cooking pots, for example, and studied them to see like what kind of residues you find there. And it's really incredible because now you know that people here, they ate, of course, the mainstay in many places was wheat and barley. In some places, you also had rice, but they also had vegetables that are very familiar to us, like brinjal, and they had spices like turmeric and ginger. So you can totally imagine someone in Dholavira making bengan bharta, and it's incredible that they were eating some foods that are so similar to what we are eating. So there were lentils as well. So yeah, we do have a fairly decent idea of the kinds of food they ate. Yeah.
Very interesting. This actually like
There
brings.
was also, sorry, there was also, one of the things about the civilization, one characteristic kind of pottery is you find a lot of perforated pots. There'd be these tall pots with perforations all over. And there are so many theories on like what that was used for. So one theory is it was used to make alcoholic beverages. Another theory based on some recent research is that at least some of these, they found residues of paneer. So
Wow.
yeah. Not much, but yes, it was there.
That's incredible. While we're on the subject of like cooking, actually, I attended this really interesting talk about the Harappans in Yemen, where it turned out that they were actually designing pots keeping in mind local tastes and preferences. So you're literally talking about trading settlements and essentially factories that are catering to local preferences. These are a very, very sophisticated and globalized people, right? You can see that all the way from their engineering abilities to the kind of like global trade connections that they had, which of course like leads to like a whole bunch of other interesting questions, like especially about the carnelian beads that you mentioned. How do we know, for example, let's say that we find a carnelian bead in somewhere in the metropolises of Akkad or something? How do we know which Harappan city it came from, for example? Are there any archaeological tools that can help us figure out stuff with that level of detail?
Yeah, so there's a lot of technological advances that have been made recent in the last few decades, which have come into archaeology as well. So I will not go into like scientific details of all of them, but for example, like if you the idea of figuring out where resources came from. So how do we know that carnelian came from a certain place, or how do we know that the limestone pillars that we saw in Harappa are actually from near Dholavira? You can do isotope analysis to see like the exact composition of these things, like how much of each kind of element is there, and match it with the elements, the composition that you find in various other places, and then you can say, okay, this is where it came from. In the case of the beads, my God, there's like an incredible amount of study that's done on just looking at the beads. You can look at them through an electron microscope, and you can actually see the grooves, for example, that were made during the drilling. And there are some archaeologists who figure out that, they see a certain pattern to say the drill holes in one bead, and they say, this looks like the drill hole in the other bead I saw, which means they were probably made by the same person or the same workshop. So
It's incredible.
there's a lot of detail that can be done like that. So this use of technology is amazing. It really gets us so far.
Fascinating. Okay, so I have a whole bunch of questions, but I also see that our audience have a whole bunch of questions. So thank you all so much for asking, and we will get to them right now, actually. So Kevin, you have a really interesting question on memories of Dholavira. Please go ahead.
Good evening, Anirudh and Meera. Thank you so much for this very exciting conversation. Like you, I'm very fascinated by these little details, and you showed us that there is a living settlement right outside Dholavira. I mean, the Indian tendency, especially with regards to monuments, is we incorporate them into our daily lives, right? There is a possibility that people would have moved bricks, would have moved stones, and used them in their modern houses, right? We know it is a heritage site now, perhaps over the last 50 or 60 years. Is there an oral tradition surrounding these sites? How have they survived for the last 2, 3, 4, 5,000 years without being completely demolished? Have they been incorporated into the memories of the people and their stories?
Okay. I'll give you a couple of examples. So now, in the case of Harappa, in fact, in the case of Harappa, a lot of the site actually, Kevin, you mentioned how they were people might take stuff from there. So actually, the railway line from Lahore to Multan was the one that actually took a lot of the bricks from Harappa to build about 100 kilometers of that railway. So a lot of the site was destroyed then. But also in the case of Harappa, there are stories about how that was associated with there's supposedly a fakir who was there and who had put a curse on the place, and all those kinds of stories were there about Harappa. In the case of MohenjoDaro, like the meaning of the word MohenjoDaro, again, MohenjoDaro is not the name of the Harappan site. This is what we call it, and MohenjoDaro means mound of the dead. So clearly there were stories about a civilization or about people who lived there and who were no longer there anymore. In the case of Dholavira, it's a little different. In the case of Dholavira, actually, its discovery again began with a farmer who, while plowing his field, he came across some pottery and I think a seal also, and that was sent to Bhuj. And then from there, from Bhuj, it went to eventually an archaeologist who figured out what it was. So in the case of Dholavira, the site itself was actually fairly quite intact. So apart from these stray bits of pottery and things that were found on the surface, the site was not really made use of by people as much. But after the excavation, locally the people do call it Kotada, which means fort, and they also call actually the ceremonial ground which I showed you, which might have been like a multi-purpose area. That area is called the bazaar. So,
While we're on the subject of Mohenjo-daro, one thought that like popped into my mind is there's just two Harappan sites so far that have World Heritage Site status, right? So there's Mohenjo-daro and there's Dholavira now. So what is it about Dholavira like that makes that qualifies it really for this status? How does it compare to Mohenjo-daro, generally speaking? And also, this kind of chronology that was discussed podcast about this kind of integration era, right, where you see some of the kind of standards that are established in the Indus Valley proper kind of spreading out to more Harappan towns. Do we know anything about the kind of people who were migrating to Dholavira during that period? And were these the same people who settled down in the middle town, for example?
So that's really two questions. So let me answer the first bit first, which is about like how does Dholavira compare to say the other World Heritage Site of the Harappan Civilization, i.e. MohenjoDaro, which got its World Heritage Site tag in 1980. Okay, so what's interesting again is like many of these, each Harappan city in many ways, especially like MohenjoDaro, Dholavira, Rakhigarhi, they're all different as a result of the different environments they're in. Now, in the case of Dholavira, it being on an island, it's not in an alluvial plain, unlike Harappa and MohenjoDaro. So, there's much more stress on. So if you go to MohenjoDaro, for example, like wells are all over the place. So every neighborhood has a well. There are private wells, there are public wells. That's not the case in Dholavira, right? In Dholavira, it's a little bit different. So there's also, another thing about the differences here. Now, you remember in the beginning of the presentation, I talked about the multiple levels of fortification that you see in Dholavira. That's not the case in MohenjoDaro. The entire city is fortified. And as is Harappa, like there are walls around different settlements of different parts of Harappa, but it's not the same way as it is in Dholavira. And in fact, in Dholavira, actually all the most of the sites of the Harappan civilization that are in Kutch, they're all fortified. And now, why were these walls built? Clearly for defense, especially in the case of Dholavira. If you see the way you approach the site, you enter, and then, just like in any modern fortification, you enter through the gate, and then you have to turn right. You make a right angle turn. So these are like basic elements of fortification, which you see in Dholavira, which you don't see in MohenjoDaro. So there are lots of differences like that between here and there. The other thing is, there are also, it's like, like today when you go to say, if you go from Bangalore to Bombay, so there are many similarities. People are dressed the same, similar kind of houses, and yet there are differences, So it may be that in their houses, they do things differently. It was kind of you can kind of draw a similar analogy to the cities of those times. So overall, there was this broad uniformity, the same beads, the same ornamentation, the same pottery, and yet there were also different kinds of pottery. So there were some kinds of pottery which are only found in Harappan, in Gujarat sites, not elsewhere. So there were variations like that. Your second question was on?
The second question is about potential migration and the actual shaping of the city during the integration.
So you would have seen like how the city really expanded during that period, right? 2600 to 1900 BC. So a part of it is, of course, like population growth, but that doesn't explain the whole thing. So what was happening here? So lots of things looks like. Now, for one thing, this period you actually start seeing in some places. Now, these things have not been studied all over the civilization, so you need to draw inferences from elsewhere. So for example, near Rakhigarhi, you actually see a decrease in the number of settlements, especially around the city, which suggests that there were actually the population from nearby settlements was actually absorbed into Rakhigarhi, and it's quite possible that something similar happened here. And in addition, there's quite a bit of evidence for migration from one place to another in Harappan sites. So, for example, there have been studies looking at bones that were found in cemeteries in Harappa and in a site called Farmana, which is not far from Delhi. And you see that you see a certain pattern emerging there, which may not be the same everywhere, but at least based on these, one thing that seems to be happening is that women are kind of staying put very often, but men are coming from elsewhere and settling down in Harappa or Farmana and being buried there. So there is a lot of migration. You can imagine I think it's similar to what you would see now. That why do people come to Bangalore? Because there's more opportunities. So they would have been in migration from various places.
It never ceases to blow my mind how similar these dynamics are to our world, right?
Exactly.
Having migration, international trade.
International trade, and amazing.
Okay, so time for a few more audience questions while we're still on the subject of cities and so on. Karthik, you have an interesting question about how the model of the Harappan city kind of spread. Why don't you go ahead and unmute yourself?
Hi Meera, thanks for the really good presentation. You mentioned that IVC, like the Indus Valley or Harappan Civilization, has one of the most widespread sites, like ranging from Sindh all the way to like Rocky Gadi in Haryana and stuff. I was wondering if, say, the far-off sites, say like Rocky Gadi, were mere adopters of the IVC technology and or architecture, in a manner how we have adopted like the Western clothes, architecture, and technology. Just probably something that worked, and they're like, hey, this is something that I saw and it works, might as well adopt it here. So, how would we differentiate, or is there any indication that that might be the case or not?
Yeah, interesting question, Karthik. Thank you. Some years ago, an archaeologist friend of mine told me in the course of a conversation, very categorically, he said, the Harappan civilization, it's not indigenous to India. It came from somewhere else. But then a few years ago, he said, I told you that the other day. That's not true. Why? Because we now find sites in India where you can actually see the development of the Harappan period, because you can find pre-Harappan settlements. So like in the case of, there's a small settlement called Bhiranna, which is not far from Rakhigarhi, where actually you have an archaeological record going back thousands of years. So you can see like early phases when, pre-Harappan, so like an aceramic thing, when they started growing, and then when they start making pottery, and then gradually you start seeing these Harappan indications. So you start seeing the development in not just one place, but in quite a few places, which suggests that it wasn't just something, I think there was a development in many places in the period, say around 5500 BCE till 2600 BC, there was this development that was happening in a number of places, right? And even before that. But you're also right that it's also true that you do see some sites where out of nothing, like somewhere suddenly you'll find Harappan settlement. And when you don't see the previous phases to it, which suggests that it was an establishment of a Harappan settlement. So I think you see both, but you cannot say that even if it is in Rakhigarhi, even if it is in the eastern side, I mean, there was this development even there. It's not something that was just adopted or planted.
All right. Now there's an interesting question about, actually got a lot of curiosity about the fortifications generally at Dholavira. So Alok, why don't you unmute yourself?
Thanks, Anirudh, and thanks, Meera, for that very, very interesting talk. I think you sort of answered a big chunk of what I was going to ask. Was that and something that you pointed out, that sites in Gujarat seem to be fortified. But is it? I mean, my initial impression of fortification is fortification for purposes of war. But do we have evidence that they withstood sieges, or there was some attack on the fort or something like that? Is there evidence of that? That is just sort of what I wanted to understand.
Well, okay, so another great question. What's really interesting, of course, one of the interesting things about the Harappan civilization is, of course, the idea that there was this fortification. It was this huge, covered this huge area, and yet there's actually not much evidence of violence. Okay, there are, for example, if you look at the seals, so if you look at the seals which depict unicorns and bulls and so on and so forth, you see seals depicting people. There are very few seals which depict people killing other people or people attacking other people, like one or two stray examples. You don't find swords, you find arrowheads, and you find ballistae, so you find like clay balls which may have been used as catapults. So in fact, in a place like in Surkotada and MohenjoDaro, you have found them near the fort walls, which suggests that maybe they were being used during some defense. But there isn't any evidence so far in any of these sites of these places being attacked. So there's no evidence that Dholavira was attacked. There is evidence for earthquake and then repair and things like that, but there's no evidence that any of these places were ever attacked. So what were they built for? So one is, of course, to keep people out, to control access. But I think that doesn't explain the whole thing, especially in a case like Dholavira, where there's so much of attention and effort and resources poured into the fortification. It does suggest that they were also defensive. So defensive against what? So raiders or dacoits who were, outside the city, probably. That's as far as we can go. That's as far as we know right now.
It were taking some pretty foolhardy dacoits to attack fortifications of that scale. This is all I can say. Okay, so that's one of the myths about the Indus Valley civilization kind of busted. The idea it's this peaceful kind of utopia. But there's another pervasive myth that it was this very egalitarian kind of society. Does the Dholavira site tell us anything about social stratification in that society? For example, were all the houses similar sized and so on?
Yeah, so that's another great question. For the most part, yes, the houses were similar in size. There are slight differences between the middle town and the castle, yes. But it's not like a marked difference. It's not like today where we have, what is that? Like never mind. There's not such obvious inequality that you see there. So it's also true that you do see a lot of infrastructure, like for example, the idea of water, right? So, or the way the streets were made. If you look at the way the streets were made in the middle town or the lower town, there are roads that are made in all these places. And this is like, no, this is quite unlike some of the other civilizations, contemporary civilizations that you see, where everything was focused on the ruler and the temple. The road leads to the temple, the road leads to the palace, but here it's not like that. So there were these facilities that were given everywhere, which suggests that, and yet, there is obviously some kind of control. There is some kind of, control of access. There are these fortifications. The castle fortification is definitely more substantial than what you see around the middle town. So there were differences. I think what I'm trying to say is, it seems like there was stratification. I don't think we can. I don't think we can say that it was a completely egalitarian society, and yet the differences between the classes, I think, were not marked. I think that's, yeah, I would go with that.
So one thing that's, as you mentioned, Meera, the one thing that's quite interesting is that in terms of the burials of people of the Harappan civilization, there's nowhere near the kind of like enormous wealth with like slaves being like sacrificed or this enormous amounts of jewelry that are buried with them. But that leads to another interesting question on the on the matter of burial practices, generally speaking. So Nikita, why don't you go ahead and unmute yourself? Okay, I'll just read the question then. In the Dholavira site plan that you showed, on the left-hand side, we see the cemetery. Were there any skeletal remains found, and what were the conclusive studies on it?
In the case of Dholavira per se, so the cemetery, the main cemetery that has been, where Dr. Bisht has actually carried out excavations, is the one that I show on the west. There are also traces of cemeteries in other parts of the outside other parts of the city, which have not been explored as yet. Interestingly, in Dholavira, I think they only found one, or was it two, bodies. So there were these really, some of these are like really, you can still go see some of these, some parts of the cemetery. Really elaborate structures, huge, like, circular structures which were built, some of them. And then there's also like rectangular structures which were built. But as I said, there were only one or possibly two bodies found. I forget exactly now. So it looks like at least, and it looks like these places were not actually all disturbed. So it's not like they were opened up and then, the bodies were removed. It doesn't look like that. So these sites were undisturbed, but they were memorial rather than actual burials in the case of Dholavira.
So this actually leads to another question that I generally had in terms of why are there so few burials in Harappan sites? Who are the people who are being buried? Do we know anything about that? Can we hazard a guess, perhaps?
Yeah. So in the case of Dholavira, and also in the case of the other Harappan sites, for Farmana, Rakhigari. So there have been burials, but if you look at the time period for which the city has been occupied, so like in the case of Dholavira, 1,500 years of or more of occupation. Similar is the case of Harappa and similar is the case of MohenjoDaro. But the number of burials that you see is like not commensurate with that, right? And you also don't see certain kinds of things. Like there are very few infant burials, for example. But even if you just look at just the adult burials, so it's obvious that not everybody was buried. So I think it's difficult for us to say, like, was it like a certain kind of some people from a particular belief system who were buried, or certain kinds of important people who were buried, or both? I don't think we have enough knowledge to comment further on that right now, but it does indicate that there was a diversity in the society, right? Because not everybody was buried. So clearly, probably some of the others were cremated, but it's not as if you cannot find archaeological evidence of cremation. It hasn't been found yet. Maybe there was other ways of disposing of the body. So, for example, was it exposed to nature? There are these various other kinds of possibilities. So, but we don't know much about how they treated their dead. All we can say is that there's a diversity.
The diversity point is just very interesting to me, because there's a tendency to think of the Harappans as a monolith, whereas in reality, we're talking about millions of people. There would have been considerable kind of diversity in terms of like who these people were, their beliefs, the way they thought about life. And that again, like, is another thing that I find is very interesting parallel to our own society today. And while we're talking about parallels to our society and globalization, that kind of stuff, Shalma has an interesting question about artifacts from other civilizations being discovered here. Okay, were there any artifacts from other civilizations found at Dholavira, like at Lothal? What do we know about religion and cultural practices in the region? So I think you've kind of answered the second question, but this question of like artifacts from other civilizations, and if you could also perhaps like talk about artifacts from elsewhere found at Lothal as well, that would be like quite interesting.
So there are some artifacts that are found, especially from the Mesopotamian areas here, including some different kinds of seals. You do see that from here. But this brings up an interesting question. So I spoke a little bit about trade between Mesopotamia and here. And so you find in the stuff all over there. You find like pottery and you find like jewelry. You find so much of that. What was it that was coming from the other side? So it looks like, so I mentioned that there were seals. It looks like also there were things that were imported from there, which were perhaps perishable. So there may have also been copper brought in from some parts, but now copper was brought in from a lot of different regions, so it's not like that was our main source. But it looks like there were also perishable items, like, for example, wool. There's not a whole lot of sheep, wool-bearing sheep in this part of the civilization, so it looks like that was probably one of the things that was brought in from there. So yes, there are artifacts, but they're not in the same numbers that we find Indus artifacts elsewhere.
Interesting. Chinmay, so Chinmay has a very fascinating question about like tourism policy and just generally the way we think about heritage. So Chinmay, why don't you like go ahead and unmute yourself?
Yeah. Hello.
Hello. Yes, go ahead.
So because so I was working with this company and not company, sorry, I'm an architect and I'm greatly interested in heritage. And compared to the world, India has a very like least amount of like heritage, world heritage sites which are sort of recognized, and after they're recognized, the recognition goes into like it being treated as an artifact of the past, right? Like there are so many things to learn in terms of systems design, in terms of infrastructure, in terms of crafts. So I was just like wondering how, like, what would be the next steps after the recognition of this as a heritage site, knowing that it is so disconnected from, say, like a major tourism route, like in a way, but there are locals who are living around, and like how does recognition help them and like the kind of things they are in?
Okay, so this is why we asked Jamal, whom you heard, to give his opinion on how the World Heritage Site is actually going to impact people in Dholavira. And if you notice, like one of the things he kept saying is that there needs to be tourism, there needs to be planned tourism. And he was also hoping that it would lead to employment for people in Dholavira and also shikshan. He mentioned shikshan, like, improve like education levels in Dholavira through all of this. And all of that can happen. But there needs to be some, as I had said earlier, there needs to be some regulation. So in India, sometimes, very often you see that this is not very well managed. So there are certain sites actually in India where, for example, like the management plan that is drawn up at the time that the site is nominated for World Heritage is actually very well done in consultation with local people. So like, for example, in the case of Jaipur, I think they did a wonderful job. But sometimes it doesn't always happen like that. So in the case of Hampi, closer home. Like if you look at Hampi, which is a World Heritage Site, there is a Hampi World Heritage Area Management Authority. But there are frequent tussles with people living in and around the monument, simply because, as you said, we tend to see the monument as something from the past. And in the case of a living heritage site like Hampi, I think that's a greater problem. In the case of a site like Dholavira, because that site is not something where people go to for anything other than tourism, it may not present as much of a problem. However, for example, in some other Indus sites, for example, there's a village called Inurkhera, which is in Uttar Pradesh, I think, where, for example, or in Rakhigarhi, if you see, for example, there is a temple from, I think, the 12th century. And people are very concerned in Rakhigarhi about they want to save that 12th century temple. So as a tourist, you and I might go there and say, Indus Valley Civilization, Harappan Civilization, but for the person living there, the temple is important. So we really need to see how these two can be integrated. We need to take people on board to see how best this can be done. There's no easy answer, except that there has to be a lot more consultation and consensus rather than coming in and saying, okay, we'll do this. That said, I think in the case of Dholavira, as I mentioned, because it's no longer like a living heritage site, it's not that people in Dholavira go there for worship or any such thing. It may not be such an intractable issue here, I hope.
So that's a very interesting question and a very interesting answer. But coming back, of course, to Dholavira as it may have been in its declining days, there's quite a lot of curiosity in the Q&A boxes about how the city really like met its end. How is it that people end up leaving? So Leo, why don't you go ahead and unmute yourself and ask your question?
Yeah, thanks, Meera. Excellent presentation. And my question is actually in the chat room, but anyway, I'll just vocalize it. I guess that's one of the greatest mysteries of humanity, that such a advanced civilization could not hold on and continue, especially given the extensive range of the urban process and the hundreds of cities that were built during that period. So why was such a massive abandonment that took place is, explained in some ways because, as you said, a long failure of the monsoons. But considering also that they were seafaring, and could it have been that there was a massive earthquake which tilted the plate in some ways, drained the entire watershed out?
If I can just quickly add to that question before you answer it, Meera. So another like whole bunch of questions related to the end of the Indus civilization. There's one interesting question that says, in modern times, we notice an increase in violence as water becomes scarce. Why is this not the case in the Indus Valley? And there's a whole bunch of other ones, but I don't think we'll have time to get to them. So sorry. Thank you all for asking so many questions, but this is not enough time.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I don't have an answer to that, but to go back to Leo's question, I think we need to rethink. Okay, so one of the things you asked is about whether an earthquake could have happened and drained out this and all. So I think we need to see Dholavira as just one site in the entire Harappan civilization. And yes, there are suggestions. Definitely the site did suffer from earthquakes. And you can see, as I mentioned, you can see that cases where the wall has been damaged by an earthquake and then rebuilt. So yes, it was a place where even today there is a lot of tectonic activity, but it doesn't seem like it was an earthquake that caused its end, right? There are also suggestions that maybe there was flooding. And again, you do see evidence for some amount of flooding, which damaged, for example, some parts of the reservoirs. But if you see its place within the civilization as a whole, even if you can, we can't just say that, say, an earthquake damaged Dholavira. What about the rest of the cities, right? So there were more than 1,000 settlements. So I think really we can't get away from climate change as being one of the drivers of the civilization changing. So the idea of a decline, we have in our minds this very dramatic view that overnight things changed and everybody just abandoned and just left. It was probably not as dramatic as all that. It took place over a few hundred years, and as I said, there were in hindsight, they're fairly rapid changes in how, for example, with a declining monsoon, the cropping patterns change. So instead of wheat and barley, you now start growing millets, because millets are, they require less water. And so you make these changes in survival in your cropping pattern. But what happens when you're growing millets? You don't have enough of a subsistence that you don't have enough of a yield that you can actually trade with other places. And so your trade is also shrinking. So all of these interconnected things are happening as a result of adapting to changing climates, which eventually lead to these settlements changing and these people migrating from these places to other places. So you see there's change happening here, really. It's not just that they abandoned and dropped everything and went. There are places where that happens as well. So some of the smaller settlements, like for example, there are some really small settlements like Surkotada, which is just 1 hectare, and some of those settlements are indeed abandoned. So they would have just moved to a different place.
I find it so interesting to think about the stories of the people who had to leave their homes, right? And I really love the bit where you talked about this, parts of the castle and the bailey actually being reoccupied in the late Harappan period, because what would have been like to live in what was essentially a ghost town, and to you're walking through the middle town and it's basically abandoned and there's all these signs of life, and then you go back to your home in the castle. I really wonder. But
sounds like there's a story there.
Absolutely. Okay, so one question that I had and that I was quite curious about is just what exactly were they doing with all this water? How were they cultivating the areas around them? What did these guys really do for food? Were they importing large amounts of food material, or were they really self-sustaining in that sense? Were they growing their own food?
It was a combination of both. In the case of Dholavira, yes, definitely a combination of both. So there was likely agriculture around in just outside the city, similar as the case with Harappa and MohenjoDaro. It is likely that there was agriculture happening just outside the city, but there would have definitely been a lot of trade in food. So there would have been a lot of food products coming in from other smaller settlements that were around there that were supplying the city. Both would have happened.
Hmm.
So if you, for example, I mentioned turmeric. Turmeric is not normally a spice that is, I don't think it used to grow in that area. So this is something that would have been brought from somewhere else for the Harappans.
Quite impressive. I mean, you're importing food and you're exporting all these high quality trading produces, very often catered to your international markets and so on. It's absolutely incredible.
Excellent business sense they had.
Absolutely. So there's a lot of questions about the evolution really of the Indus city plan, and if I can just add on to that, you mentioned a little earlier that we can see how these towns are kind of growing and how they're figuring out city planning, but do you think about how they figure out engineering, especially hydraulic engineering? Do we know how their ambitions grew to the point where they're able to build these massive reservoirs and channel every single drop of water? Is there any evidence about that?
Short answer, no. Sorry, no, we don't really know how exactly they did it. Was there a trial and error? Did they start off small? We don't really know. No.
That's quite a shame. Okay, so let me just turn back to the Q&A box. I think we've covered broadly most of the big themes, except there's still, I think, a lot of curiosity about the decipherment of the Indus script. So there's a few questions about like why has it been so difficult to decipher it, and what is really the current state of the decipherment? Is it something that we could potentially see? Could we potentially see the script being cracked within our lifetimes, for example?
Yeah, so I mentioned that one of the big hurdles in the decipherment of the script, although we have thousands of inscriptions, most of them are on seals. You do have inscriptions on bangles and pots and things like that. But think about it, they're all like small, like the average size of an inscription on a seal will be like 4 letters or 5 letters. In fact, even less, like 3.5 letters is the average. But you may say 4 letters, 5 letters. There are some which are, I think one of the longest is 17 letters. And then there's a suggestion that there've been some copper plates whose provenance is not yet definitely known. They may be fake, which seem to have, I think, 43 or so, a sequence of 43 letters. Now, why is this important? It becomes important because if you think about how you decipher a script, you need to see patterns in it, right? And if you only have short things, then you don't really get enough information to make any replacements or substitutions which will help you towards your decipherment of the script. So if you look at English, the most common letter is E, and if you have a stretch of text, you can replace the most common letter with E, and then you'll start doing things from there. But with these, because the inscriptions are so short, it's difficult to actually come up with enough data for you to able to do such things. Now that said, there are patterns that people have been studying. So there are patterns, so you can figure out that these are the letters which are used most often. These are the letters which come at the beginning and at the end most often. You can also see evolution in the script itself. There are over the period, you see, like even in the 700 years of the mature period, you do see slight changes. Like there are new signs that seem to be coming into the script. So why is it not being deciphered? Yeah, because of all of these issues, especially because it's so short. Now, if you think about how other scripts were deciphered, so if you think about how Brahmi was deciphered as a script, so it's largely very often like the crux of the issue is to find a bilingual inscription. So like the Rosetta Stone or the cuneiform script, which is again deciphered because of a bilingual thing. So like there is a possibility, given that there are strong relations with the Mesopotamians that we had, there is a possibility, and the texts which speak about Meluhan interpreters, for example. So maybe there will be something found at some point talking about, something in cuneiform and in the Harappan script. It's quite possible. But in the absence of that, we can only hope that, as I mentioned, there is a lot of effort being put in terms of looking at, again, studying patterns that are there in these and trying to see if there can be some decipherment from there. There are also people who, we do know, it seems likely that the language was a Dravidian language. So there are people like Askopat, for example, who were trying to see if there could be, some of these signs mean something. For example, the fish sign, does it mean mean? In Tamil, mean means fish. So if you put that in, then what are the things that can be said about it? So there are people who are attacking it from different directions, but so far it hasn't really led to a complete decipherment. If we get a bilingual, and if we get put in enough, more, as I said, computing, I have great hopes that something will happen.
If there is a Rosetta Stone for the Harappans, I mean, it will probably like totally transform our understanding of the Bronze Age, because this is the largest Bronze Age civilization of which we know absolutely nothing. It might, and that's the interesting thing is that compared to other Bronze Age civilizations, as you said, that there are class differences, but they're really not that meaningful, right? They're not so substantial. And to me, at least, it seems to say that, there's this tendency to think of human civilization as always having to be unequal, always having to be violent and centered around monarchs. And that the Harappans might potentially give us an example of one of the earliest and largest human civilizations being totally different is something that I personally find it
Yeah,
extremely exciting.
I think it is an exciting thought, Anirudh. I don't want to hold it up as this totally utopian civilization with
Fair
no
enough.
violence and no stratification, because there was a bit of both.
Yes.
But you're right that it is not a society that was shaped so strongly by violence, and it is not a society where stratifications were so apparent. Within it. Yeah, so that is actually a sign of hope. Yes, absolutely.
All right. So just I think there's just time for like one last question, which I'll just ask because we're already like so low on time. And this is like what was happening in the rest of the Indian subcontinent at this time. Is there any evidence of like settlements or like urban settlements like emerging in the Gangetic Plains, for example, or elsewhere in South India later, even after the Indus civilization? Are there any connections or like evidence of any kind of archaeological ties that, like, I mean, we're talking about like the realm of hard facts here, not about mythology.
Okay. Yeah, I note the caveat. Um, happening in the rest of the civilization of the subcontinent at that time. So there were other kinds of cultures that were there around the country. Neolithic civilization, for example, in southern India, large parts of it. Neolithic would be, for example, in Karnataka, there were people who were building these very large ash mounds. And there would have been some trade connections between some of these other civilizations and the Harappans, definitely. Even as far as South India, there is every chance. There is a strong possibility that things like, for example, gold went from here all the way to the Harappans. So there is that possibility, yes. Even within the Harappan regions, outside the Harappan cities, there were other communities living there which were not quite, which didn't exhibit the same kind of markers of the Harappan civilization. So there were other cultures which also interacted with the Harappans outside, hunter-gatherer communities also existed. For example, in Lothal, it's known that they were actually they had good relations between the hunter-gatherers who lived outside the settlement of Lothal. So there were other kinds of civilizations, other kinds of communities and civilizations, cultures that were there at the same time as around the country, definitely, yeah. But not urban. Urban comes only later, much after.
Right. Fascinating. And yeah, I mean, what an incredible session. Thank you so much, Meera. You've like really taken
Thank you,
us
Anirudh.
from the most humdrum level of the daily lives of the Harappans all the way to like the grand historical forces that shaped them. And like I had a grand time. And thank you so much to the almost 200 members of the audience who like stayed so far and for all your questions. You've made this really, really interesting to moderate.
Thank you. And thank you, Raghu and Lekha and Anirudh, yes.
270 people at one time. Well, who thought flooring and drains could be so exciting? Both your palpable excitement and enthusiasm has seemingly turned infectious, Anirudh and Meera. The valley has been a source of so much mystique for a layperson and such a wealth of information for scholars. And it's so fascinating to see so many parallels with our current lives. Thank you for this fantastic presentation, Meera, as always, and for your masterful interlocution, Anirudh. Here's to looking back and to lessons being learned. Thank you to the audience for attending in such large numbers. Now we will say good night and see you next time.
Good night. Take care.